Hi guys, welcome to Bedtime Sleepy. Settle in, and let's quietly step into another forgotten corner of American history. Winter, 1880s, American frontier. This map tells a story. Across the Great Plains and scattered frontier settlements, families built homes where the wind never seemed to stop. A few inches on the map meant days of travel. A distant town could feel 100 miles farther once the snow arrived. Farmers watched their food supplies shrink. Children slept beside weak fires. Widows waited through long nights, listening to storms shake the walls. When blizzards buried roads and temperatures plunged, survival became a daily calculation. Not everyone was fighting nature. Many were fighting loneliness. This is their story. The nail in her boot had frozen to the floorboard. Anna Kessler didn't notice until she tried to stand. Her breath hung in front of her face in the dark, a small grey ghost that wouldn't dissolve. Outside, the wind wasn't howling anymore. It had stopped, and that silence was worse. Somewhere past the buried door of the soddy, 7 of her neighbours were dying. She didn't know that yet. She only knew that the fire had burned down to a handful of orange coals, and the water bucket by the stove had a skin of ice across the top, and her husband hadn't come back from the barn. That was the winter that taught the American frontier a lesson it never fully recovered from. Not that winter could kill, everyone already knew that. The lesson was how fast it could happen, how little warning it gave, and how many people had built their entire lives on the bet that this time the weather would behave. It didn't. On the morning of January 7th, 1873, the sky over the Dakota Territory was the kind of blue that farmers called a gift. Children walked to one-room schoolhouses without their coats buttoned. Men left their soddies and shanties without a second thought, heading out to check on livestock or split wood, or visit a neighbour 3 miles off. The temperature sat comfortably above freezing. It felt, several survivors later wrote, like the first real breath of an early spring. Roosters crowed like it was April. Icicles along the eaves had started to drip, one slow bead at a time, tapping a soft rhythm against the frozen ground below. Somewhere a dog barked at nothing in particular, the way dogs do when the air itself feels different, lighter, safer. Women hung wet laundry outside for the first time in weeks, certain the mild air would dry it by supper. Farmers who'd spent January mornings huddled indoors for years found themselves out in shirt sleeves that gave them absolutely no reason for worry. That's what makes this story so hard to sit with, even now. There was no warning shot, no darkening on the horizon that gave anyone an hour's head start. The weather had lulled an entire territory into believing the worst of winter was already behind them. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, the temperature had fallen more than 40 degrees. Wind speeds climbed past 60 miles an hour. Snow arrived sideways, in sheets so thick that a grown man couldn't see his own hand held at arm's length. The storm swallowed the horizon in minutes, and it didn't let go for 3 days. Historians would eventually name it the Great Blizzard of 1873. Locals who lived through it just called it the storm that came without asking. Here's the question that should unsettle you, whether you've ever set foot on a prairie or not. If the sky over your own house turned from blue to black in the time it takes to walk home from work, would you make it? Before we go further into what happened to the families scattered across that frozen territory, I want to say something to the people who've made this a place to unwind at the end of a long day. If stories like this one help you slow down and drift toward rest, staying close to this channel means there's always another one waiting for you when you need it. No pressure, no noise, just history told the way it deserves to be told, at the pace it deserves to be told at. Now, back to that January afternoon, and to Anna Kessler, who had no way of knowing that her husband was already lost somewhere between the barn and the house. Anna was 26 years old that winter. She'd crossed the Atlantic from a small farming village outside Stuttgart 3 years earlier, married a man named Joseph Kessler, who she'd known for less than 4 months before the wedding, and followed him west to 160 acres of open Dakota grassland that the government called free and the wind called merciless. Their home wasn't a house in any sense a modern person would recognise. It was a soddy, a dwelling cut directly from the earth, walls built from thick bricks of prairie sod stacked like books on a shelf, a roof of moor sod laid over a skeleton of scavenged wood. It kept the cold out better than canvas. It also meant that during a hard rain, the ceiling wept dirt onto the floor for hours afterward. That was the frontier most people never picture when they hear the word. Not covered wagons rolling towards some golden sunset. Not gunfights in dusty streets. Just a young woman standing in a room made of dirt, watching her breath fog in the lamplight, wondering how long she could keep a fire alive with the wood supply she had left. Fuel itself was its own quiet crisis out here. Trees were scarce enough that families burned dried buffalo chips, twisted hay and corn cobs just to keep a stove warm through the coldest stretches. Anna kept a woven basket of twisted hay beside the stove, refilling it almost daily, because a proper cord of firewood might as well have been a luxury shipped in from another country. She measured her winter not in weeks, but in baskets, in how many more twists of hay stood between her family and a cold morning. That afternoon, with the sky still strangely warm and blue, she hadn't given the basket a second thought. By nightfall, she would count every twist in it like a woman counting minutes. The families who settled the Dakota and Nebraska frontier in the early 1870s were overwhelmingly foreign-born. German and Norwegian and Swedish immigrants made up whole townships, drawn by railroad advertisements, promising rich soil and mild climates that existed mostly in the imagination of the men selling land. What the pamphlets didn't mention was that this open, treeless country offered nothing to break the wind. No forest, no hills, no shelter of any kind for 50 miles in some directions. When a storm came, it came at full strength, with nothing standing between it and a small dirt house holding a woman, a stove, and a fear she hadn't let herself name out loud. Whole townships in that part of Dakota Territory were named for the villages their settlers had left behind. Tiny outposts with German and Scandinavian names stitched onto an unfamiliar map. Neighbours lived close in spirit but far in distance, sometimes 2 or 3 miles between one soddy and the next, a gap that felt like nothing on a calm afternoon, and like an ocean once the snow started falling sideways. Most families had exactly one option if the weather turned while someone was outside, and that option was hope. There was no sheriff to call, no radio warning, no way to know that 70 miles away, in towns with real newspapers and real telegraph offices, meteorologists were already recording pressure drops that no one out on the open prairie would ever see in time to matter. By the time full dark fell on January 7th, the temperature had dropped to nearly 40 below zero once the wind chill was factored in. Snow had already buried the path between the house and the barn under drifts taller than a man. Joseph Kessler had gone out at 3 that afternoon to bring in the last of the cattle, following a length of rope he'd tied from the door to the barn just in case. He hadn't come back. Anna waited by the window for an hour before she let herself accept that something was wrong. She waited another hour before she made a decision that would either save her husband's life or end her own. What she chose to do next, and what she found when she finally opened that door into a world gone completely white, is where this story truly begins. Because the deadliest winter in frontier history didn't just take lives with cold, it took them with confusion, with impossible choices, and with a kind of darkness that swallowed direction itself. Families lost each other at a distance of 10 feet. Livestock froze standing upright, and somewhere in that vast howling nothing, more than 200 people would not survive to see the sun again. What's remarkable is that this storm didn't just strike one isolated farm or one unlucky county. It swallowed a stretch of open country running from Nebraska up through the Dakotas and into Minnesota all in the same few hours. Telegraph wires snapped under the weight of ice. Word of the danger, when it existed at all, travelled slower than the storm itself. By the time anyone in a distant town realised how bad things had gotten, the people caught out in it had already made their choices, for better or for worse. This is the story of what the American frontier was really like when winter decided to collect its due. Not the postcard version, the real one. The smell hits first, wet wool drying too close to a stove, mixed with the sour tang of a kerosene lamp burning low. Underneath it, faint and constant, the smell of packed earth, because the walls themselves are made of dirt, and dirt never quite stops smelling like dirt, no matter how many years a family has called it home. This is a soddy in the Dakota Territory, in the fall of 1872, 3 months before the sky turns against everyone living inside one. There's no glass in most of the windows, just oiled paper stretched tight, enough to let in grey light and keep out the worst of the wind. The floor is packed dirt too, swept so many times it's gone smooth and almost shines in the lamplight, like stone worn down by a river. You'd expect it to feel like a cave. It doesn't, not entirely. Anna Kessler has hung a quilt on one wall, brought from Germany in a trunk that took up half her space on the ship over, faded reds and blues that catch just enough lamplight to remind her that colour still exists somewhere in the world. A rocking chair, built by Joseph from Cottonwood, scavenged along a dry creek bed, sits close enough to the stove that its legs have scorched slightly darker than the rest of the wood. Listen closely enough, and you can hear the wind before you can see it. Out here, on ground this flat, wind doesn't announce itself with rustling leaves or creaking branches, because there are no trees close enough to make that sound. It just moves, low and constant, a sound like breathing that never stops day or night, winter or summer. Settlers who grew up in wooded country back east said the silence of the prairie unsettled them more than any storm, an emptiness with nothing to catch the sound and throw it back. Fall on the Dakota frontier in 1872 didn't look like fall anywhere else in the country. There was no riot of orange and red, no forest floor turning to copper, just endless grass, chest high in places, bending in long gold waves under a sky so wide it seemed to curve at the edges. Farmers ploughed straight furrows into that grass with steel ploughs pulled by oxen, breaking sod that had never known a blade before, turning up soil so dark and rich that men wept over it, actual grown men kneeling in dirt and crying because they'd never owned anything before crossing an ocean to get here. That soil was the entire reason anyone endured what came next. The land was free, or close enough to free, under the Homestead Act that Congress had signed a decade earlier, offering 160 acres to any citizen or any immigrant who filed the right paperwork, willing to live on it and work it for 5 years. Railroad agents travelled through German and Scandinavian villages promising fortunes, showing painted illustrations of golden wheat fields and mild winters that bore almost no resemblance to reality. Anne and Joseph had believed those illustrations, or at least believed them enough to sell what little they owned, and board a ship bound for a country neither of them had seen. Daily life moved to a rhythm dictated entirely by the sun and the season. Anna rose before dawn to stoke the stove, her hands cracked and reddened from lye soap and cold water, and started the day's bread with flour ground so coarse it left grit between the teeth if you weren't careful chewing. Joseph was already out with the animals by the time grey light crept through the oiled paper windows, tending 2 milk cows, a handful of chickens and a team of oxen, that represented most of what the couple owned in the world. Water came from a well Joseph had dug by hand, 40 feet down through packed clay, hauled up bucket by bucket in weather that would eventually freeze the rope solid to the winch. Meals were simple and repetitive in a way that modern kitchens would find almost unbearable. Cornmeal mush, salt pork when they had it, dried beans soaked overnight, bread baked in a small iron stove that struggled to hold an even heat. Fresh vegetables existed only during a short window in late summer, and anything not eaten immediately was pickled, dried, or buried in a root cellar dug into the side of a low-rise near the house. A treat, on the rare occasion Anna could manage one, meant molasses drizzled over the mush, or dried apples brought from a trading post nearly a day's ride away. Neighbours were scattered, but not absent. A loose network of families who'd settled close enough together to help with a barn raising or a difficult birth, but far enough apart that a visit required real planning. The Halversons lived 2 miles north, a Norwegian family with 4 children who'd arrived the same year as the Kesslers. The Brennemans, a German couple slightly older than Anna and Josef, lived just over a mile south, and Anna had grown close to Greta Brenneman over long afternoons of shared sewing and half-translated German conversation, since Greta's dialect differed enough from Anna's own that they sometimes had to work out a shared word between them. Clothing on the frontier had to do double duty as both protection and proof of thrift. Anna wore wool stockings she'd knitted herself over 2 winters, layered under a heavy skirt that had once belonged to her mother back in Stuttgart. Patched at the hem so many times the original fabric barely showed through anymore. Joseph's coat was buffalo hide, purchased second-hand from a trapper passing through, stiff and heavy and smelling faintly of the animal it once belonged to, but warmer than anything wool could manage on the worst days. Children in the district wore whatever their mothers could piece together from flour sacks and worn adult garments, mittens sewn from scraps, boots stuffed with dried grass when the leather grew too thin to hold heat on its own. The nearest schoolhouse sat almost 4 miles from the Kessler place, a single room heated by a potbelly stove that the oldest boys took turns feeding through the day. In good weather, a dozen children walked there together, cutting across open pasture in a loose pack, trading stories and complaints the way children do everywhere. In bad weather, the schoolhouse simply emptied, because no parent in that district would risk a child on open ground once the wind picked up past a certain point. Even so, the winter of 1872 into 1873 had been mild enough by December that the schoolteacher, a young unmarried woman named Sophie Lindqvist boarding with the Halversons, had grown almost casual about dismissing early when clouds gathered. That habit, built on months of storms that announced themselves with plenty of warning, would matter enormously come January. What's remarkable is how much genuine joy people managed to build inside lives this hard. Dances held in whatever barn was largest that season, a fiddle player passed between townships like a treasured object, children running between soddies in games that needed nothing but open space and imagination. Winter itself wasn't feared in the way you might expect, not at first. Settlers who'd survived a season or 2 on the prairie developed a kind of confidence, a belief that they understood this land now, that they'd learned its moods and could read its warnings. That confidence would prove to be the most dangerous thing any of them owned. By December of 1872, the Kesslers had settled into a routine that felt, for the first time since leaving Germany, something close to secure. The root cellar was full. The wooden hay basket by the stove stayed reasonably stocked, thanks to trading trips to the nearest town, a full day's journey by wagon. Josef had built a rope line from the house to the barn after hearing stories from the Halversons about a Norwegian settler 2 counties over who'd frozen to death just 40 feet from his own door during a whiteout the previous winter. That detail should have frightened them more than it did. Instead, it became just another piece of frontier wisdom, filed away alongside advice about snake bites and prairie fires and the proper way to render lard. Danger was constant out here, and constant danger has a way of losing its edge, becoming background noise instead of warning. The Kesslers had made it through one full Dakota winter already, a hard one, with temperatures that dropped low enough to crack the water in the well bucket overnight. They'd learned to layer wool against skin that had never known cold like this in Germany, to seal gaps in the sod walls with mud and dried grass, to ration fuel with the discipline of people who understood exactly what running out would mean. By the time the new year turned toward 1873, Anna genuinely believed she understood winter on this land. She had no way of knowing that everything she thought she'd learned was about to be tested by a storm, unlike anything the territory had recorded before, one that would arrive on a morning warm enough to fool every farmer within 100 miles. Frost had crept up the inside of the window glass in a pattern that looked almost like ferns, delicate white branches spreading across the pane from the corners inward. Anna pressed her palm against it and felt nothing but cold. No warmth left in the glass at all, even from a stove burning just 6 feet away. Outside that thin barrier of frost and glass, a world was ending for people who thought they knew exactly where they stood. Most people, when they picture a blizzard death on the American frontier, imagine someone lost far from home, a traveller caught between towns, a rancher separated from his herd by miles of open country, wandering in circles until exhaustion took him. That image feels right because it matches every frontier story we've absorbed from old films and dime novels, the vast empty distance swallowing a single tiny figure. But the truth of the Great Blizzard of 1873, and of frontier blizzards in general, cuts against that picture almost entirely. Government weather records and county coroner reports from the era tell a different story, one far harder to sit with. A significant share of the dead were found within a few hundred feet of their own homes, sometimes closer than that, sometimes near enough to touch the walls of the very shelter that could have saved them. Joseph Kessler followed a rope from his own front door. That rope existed precisely because he understood the danger of losing his bearings in open country. And still, in the mounting chaos of a whiteout, a length of rope tied to a doorframe was no guarantee at all, because rope can snap under the weight of ice, or slip loose from cold-numbed fingers, or simply run out 15 feet short of a barn a man believed he knew by heart. Newspapers across the Dakota and Nebraska territories spent weeks that January and February printing accounts gathered from county officials and surviving neighbours, and a pattern emerged that unsettled even hardened frontier editors. Time after time, the dead weren't strangers to the land who'd wandered into unfamiliar country. They were farmers on their own 160 acres, walking routes they'd covered thousands of times, caught by a storm that erased every visual marker they relied on to navigate. A man could know every fence post and gully on his own property by heart, and still lose all of it the instant the wind stripped away visibility past his own outstretched arm. Historical accounts from Dakota and Nebraska counties describe farmers found frozen against their own fence posts, within shouting distance of a lit window, unable to see the light through snow so dense it blotted out everything beyond arm's length. One frequently cited case from the same storm system involved a man in Nebraska who tied a rope from his house to his barn, much like Joseph had, and still lost his way and froze less than 100 yards from his own door. Distance, it turns out, meant almost nothing once visibility dropped to zero. What mattered was disorientation, the total collapse of a person's ability to know which direction meant safety and which meant wandering deeper into open ground. What strikes me most is how ordinary the mistake usually was. It wasn't recklessness that killed most of these people. It was a single wrong turn, a rope that gave out, a door that looked identical to a barn wall once the world had gone entirely white. There's a second myth wrapped inside the first, one just as persistent. Many assume the coldest temperatures were what killed the majority of victims, that this was a simple story of thermometers dropping low enough to stop a human heart. Actual cause of death patterns from blizzards like this one tell a more complicated story. Hypothermia certainly killed plenty of people, but disorientation, exhaustion, and a strange, poorly understood phenomenon called paradoxical undressing accounted for a startling number of deaths as well. Paradoxical undressing happens in the final stages of severe hypothermia, when a dying body's blood vessels, having constricted for hours to protect the core, suddenly and catastrophically dilate. A rush of warm blood floods back into the extremities, tricking a freezing, disoriented brain into believing the body is suddenly overheated. Victims in this state have been documented removing coats, gloves, even boots, convinced in their final confused minutes that they were burning up rather than dying of cold. Searchers who found bodies in the aftermath of blizzards like the one that struck in January of 1873 sometimes found victims partially unclothed in snowbanks, a detail that horrified rescuers who couldn't understand why a freezing person would ever remove protection from the cold that was killing them. Livestock suffered under a version of the same confusion, though for entirely different physical reasons. Cattle caught in the open during the storm instinctively turned their backs to the wind and simply walked with it, drifting for miles in whatever direction the gale happened to push them. Ranchers across the affected territory later found entire herds piled against fence lines and gullies, dozens of miles from where they'd started, frozen together in the exact formation the storm had driven them into. That same instinct, useful in an ordinary snowstorm, became a death sentence in a blizzard that didn't relent for 3 straight days, driving animals farther and farther from any shelter or feed until exhaustion and cold finished what the wind had started. This detail rarely makes it into popular retellings of frontier winter stories. It's easier, and frankly less disturbing, to imagine a quick, clean death from cold, someone simply drifting off to sleep in the snow. The reality was often confused, disoriented, and cruelly ironic, a body betraying its own owner in the last minutes of life. Rescue parties that finally moved through the affected counties once the storm broke on January 9th and 10th described a landscape that looked less like a natural disaster and more like a battlefield frozen mid-motion. Men were found kneeling, as though they'd stopped to rest for just a moment. Others were found standing upright against fence lines, snow packed so tightly around their legs that it had held their bodies in place like statues. A doctor from one Dakota county, writing to a territorial newspaper that spring, described the strange calm on many of the victims' faces, noting that whatever terror they'd felt in those final confused minutes had apparently passed before the end came, replaced by something closer to exhausted surrender. The schoolteacher Sophie Lindqvist, 4 miles from the Kessler farm, understood none of this when the sky began to change that afternoon. She dismissed her dozen students only an hour before the temperature began its catastrophic plunge, trusting the mild morning weather the way any reasonable person would. Several of her students lived close enough to walk home in 15 minutes under normal conditions. By the time the storm hit full force, normal conditions no longer existed anywhere in that township. County records from the aftermath of the Great Blizzard of 1873 list dozens of deaths among schoolchildren caught between the schoolhouse and home, a detail that would eventually change how frontier communities thought about early dismissal policy entirely. Before this storm, teachers across the territory operated on instinct, sending children home the moment weather looked threatening, trusting that shorter distances meant greater safety. After this storm, and after others that followed later that same decade, some rural schools began keeping children through even worsening conditions, on the theory that a sturdy schoolhouse with a working stove was safer than an unpredictable walk home, however short that walk might seem. That shift in thinking didn't happen because someone read a study or attended a conference. It happened because families buried children who died within sight of their own front porches, and communities searched for any lesson that might prevent it from happening again. Some of those changes took root slowly, debated at kitchen tables and church gatherings long before any territorial government put a rule to paper. A few districts began stocking schoolhouses with extra fuel and blankets, enough to keep children fed and warm through an unplanned overnight stay if weather turned without warning. Others adopted a simple rule that would have sounded absurd to a teacher in December of 1872, that no child should be sent home once snow began falling in earnest, regardless of how short the walk appeared to be. It took real deaths, real names read aloud at real funerals, before that kind of caution stopped feeling like an overreaction and started feeling like common sense. Anna didn't know any of this on the afternoon of January 7th, standing at her frosted window and watching the blue sky curdle into something the colour of an old bruise. She only knew that Joseph had gone out along a rope he trusted completely, into a distance he'd walked 1,000 times without incident, and that trust and familiarity were about to mean absolutely nothing at all. What she was about to learn, in the space of a single terrifying hour, was a lesson the entire frontier would eventually learn the hard way. Safety was never about how far you'd travelled from home. It was about whether you could still find your way back to it once the world disappeared around you. Her hands told the story before her voice ever could. Knuckles swollen from years of wringing wet wool in ice water, a thin white scar across one thumb from a sewing needle that slipped during her first winter alone, skin cracked at the fingertips no matter how much tallow she worked into them each night. Anna Kessler was 26 years old, and her hands already belonged to a woman twice that age. She was born in 1847 in a farming village outside Stuttgart, the third of 6 children in a family that worked land they didn't own, paying rent to a landlord who lived in the city and had never once walked the fields himself. Her father died when she was 14, a fever that moved through their village in a single terrible month and took 11 people with it, and after that Anna spent her adolescence doing a grown man's work in the fields alongside her older brothers, because the family needed every pair of hands it could put to use. She met Joseph Kessler at a village dance in the spring of 1869, a broad-shouldered young man 3 years older than her who talked, almost obsessively, about a place called America, where a person could own land outright, where no landlord would ever knock on your door demanding rent for soil you'd broken your back ploughing. Anna married him 4 months later, not entirely out of love, if she was honest with herself, but out of something closer to hope, a bet that this quiet, serious man might actually deliver on the promise he kept making. The crossing itself took 3 weeks, most of it spent in steerage below deck, packed alongside hundreds of other families making the same bet. Anna was seasick for the first 10 days, unable to keep down more than a few spoonfuls of broth, and she remembered thinking, somewhere in the worst of it, that she might die on that ship without ever setting foot in the country she'd sold everything to reach. She didn't die. She arrived in New York in June of 1870, took a train west with Joseph, and a single trunk containing everything they owned and stood for the first time on the Dakota grassland that would become theirs, if they could survive 5 years of living on it. That was the deal the government offered under the Homestead Act, and it was a deal that sounded generous on paper and felt nearly impossible in practice. 5 years of continuous residence, 5 years of proving up the claim through cultivation and improvement, 5 years standing between a family and true ownership of 160 acres. Anna and Joseph were only 3 years into that 5-year clock on the afternoon the sky turned against them, close enough to see the finish line and far enough away that losing everything now would mean losing it all. The years, the risk, the ocean crossing, every bit of it. The grasshopper plague of 1871 had come without warning too, arriving on a hot July afternoon as a low humming cloud on the horizon that Anna initially mistook for smoke from a distant prairie fire. Within hours, the insects had stripped their entire wheat crop down to bare stalks, chewed through the wooden handles of farm tools left outside, and even, according to more than one neighbour's account, eaten the wool right off the backs of sheep too slow to find shelter. Joseph had stood in the middle of that ruined field afterward, saying nothing for the better part of an hour, and Anna remembered that silence more than any words he could have spoken, because it told her exactly how close they had come to losing everything in a single afternoon. They'd survived that year on credit extended by a sympathetic merchant in the nearest town, and on a smaller secondary crop of turnips, the grasshoppers had somehow left mostly untouched. What strikes me most about Anna isn't her courage, though she had plenty of it. It's how ordinary her fears were, how recognisable they'd be to anyone listening to this story more than a century and a half later. She feared debt. She feared another failed harvest like the one that had nearly broken them in 1871. When grasshoppers descended on the territory in numbers thick enough to blot out the sun and stripped every field bare in a matter of days, she feared, most quietly and most constantly, that she might never see her mother again, that the ocean between them had become permanent the moment she boarded that ship, and that whatever happened to her out here on this vast indifferent grassland would happen without a single member of her birth family ever knowing the full truth of it. She kept a small photograph of her mother tucked inside the family Bible, taken by a travelling photographer who'd passed through her village the year before she left, and she looked at it most nights before blowing out the lamp, a private ritual Joseph had learned never to interrupt. Joseph himself was a harder man to read, not cold exactly, but economical with his words in the way many men raised on hard farm labour tend to be. He'd grown up the youngest of 3 brothers on a small holding outside Hanover, watched his 2 older brothers inherit what little land the family had, and understood by the time he was 20 that Germany held no real future for a man in his position. America for Joseph wasn't a dream so much as a math problem, one where the numbers finally worked in his favour if he was willing to endure enough discomfort to see it through. He wasn't a demonstrative husband, but Anna had come to recognise his particular ways of showing care. The rocking chair built from scavenged cottonwood, the rope line strung to the barn after hearing about a neighbour who'd frozen within reach of his own door, the way he always let her eat first when food was scarce, claiming he wasn't hungry even when his hollowed cheek said otherwise. He carried, too, a quiet guilt about the crossing itself, one Anna only glimpsed occasionally in unguarded moments. It had been his idea to leave Germany, his conviction that pulled her away from her mother and sisters, and every hardship the Dakota frontier handed them afterward seemed, in his mind at least, to be a debt he owed her. He worked harder than any man in the district, partly because of that debt, rising before dawn even on mornings when nothing strictly needed doing, as though sheer effort might somehow make up for everything the ocean crossing had cost his wife. By January of 1873, the Kesslers had buried one child, a daughter born too early in the fall of 1871 who lived only 6 days, and that loss sat between them in a way neither of them spoke about directly, but that shaped every quiet decision they made afterward. Anna sometimes wondered, in her most honest moments, whether that small grave marked with a wooden cross out past the root cellar was the real reason she couldn't yet bring herself to love this land the way Joseph seemed to, why some part of her still measured every season against the ocean voyage she sometimes wished she'd never made. And yet she stayed. She stayed because leaving now would mean the grief, the crossing, the grasshoppers, and everything else had all happened for nothing. She stayed because Joseph needed a partner in this, not a woman waiting to go home. She stayed because on her better days she could stand outside at dusk and watch the prairie turn gold and purple in a way that genuinely took her breath away. And she'd think just for a moment that maybe this place could become home after all. That was the woman standing at her frosted window on the afternoon of January 7th, 1873, watching her husband disappear into a wall of white that had swallowed the barn, the fence line, and every familiar shape in the world outside. She was not a woman built for panic. She'd survived a landlord's cruelty, an ocean crossing, a dead infant daughter, and a plague of grasshoppers that had nearly starved her family the year before. But nothing in her 26 years had prepared her for watching the man she'd crossed an ocean beside vanish into a silence that had already stopped sounding like wind and started sounding like something closer to a held breath. She stood at that window for exactly 1 hour before she made a decision that would test everything she was. What she chose in that hour, and what it cost her, is a thread that runs straight through the rest of this story, resurfacing at the moments that matter most, because some choices don't end when the moment passes. They follow a person for the rest of her life. A single lantern burned in the Halverson Soddy 2 miles north, its light swallowed completely by the storm before it travelled even 50 feet from the window glass. Anders Halverson stood watching that useless glow and made a decision that would have seemed reckless to anyone back in Norway, a decision built entirely on instincts he'd developed only after nearly losing everything the year before. He did not go outside. His wife would later say he stood at that same window for nearly 2 hours, watching a lantern he'd hung on the barn door slowly disappear into whiteness, resisting every impulse in his body that told him to go check on the animals himself. You might assume, hearing this story, that the newcomers to this land, the immigrants still learning its rhythms and dangers, suffered the worst of what the Great Blizzard of 1873 delivered. That assumption feels logical. Surely the families who'd only lived on the Dakota frontier for 2 or 3 years understood the land less than those who'd been raised on it, and surely that unfamiliarity cost them dearly when the sky turned. The historical record tells a more complicated and frankly more unsettling story. County death registers and survivor testimonies gathered in the storm's aftermath reveal that a disproportionate number of the dead were not recent immigrants at all, but rather American-born ranchers and homesteaders who lived on the plains for a decade or longer, men and women who considered themselves seasoned, who trusted an intimate familiarity with the land that had served them well through dozens of ordinary storms. That very confidence, built over years of successfully outlasting difficult weather, appears to have worked against them when a storm arrived that broke every rule they thought they understood. Recent immigrant families, still carrying a fresh and unresolved fear of this unfamiliar country, often erred on the side of caution in ways their more experienced neighbours did not. One case documented by a territorial newspaper that spring involved a rancher who'd worked the same stretch of Nebraska grassland for nearly 15 years, a man locals described as knowing every rise and gully on his property better than he knew his own children's faces. He'd survived storms that had killed newer arrivals in previous winters, and neighbours later recalled him joking only days before the blizzard hit about how greenhorns panicked over weather that seasoned plainsmen simply weathered through with common sense and preparation. That same rancher went out during the storm's opening hour to move cattle he judged to be in no real danger, certain his 15 years of experience gave him an accurate read on how bad things would actually get. He was found 3 days later, less than a quarter mile from his own barn, in a position rescuers described as though he'd simply sat down to rest. Anders Halverson had lost 2 cows the previous winter, after venturing out during what he judged to be a manageable storm, a storm that turned out to be far more dangerous than his experience had prepared him to recognise. That failure, humiliating and costly at the time, had taught him something the old-timers around him hadn't yet learned, that his own judgment about Dakota weather could not be trusted the way judgment about German or Norwegian weather could be trusted, because this land played by rules he hadn't fully absorbed yet. So when the temperature began its catastrophic collapse on the afternoon of January 7th, Anders didn't reach for his coat. He barred the door, gathered his 4 children close to the stove, and refused every instinct telling him he should check on the animals himself. Most people don't realise how much of frontier survival came down not to strength or experience, but to a willingness to distrust your own confidence at exactly the moment confidence felt most justified. This isn't a story about immigrants being naturally more cautious or about long-time settlers being reckless fools. The truth sits in messier territory than either of those simple narratives. Confidence, once earned through real experience, becomes almost impossible to set aside, even when the situation in front of you no longer matches the situation that taught you to trust yourself in the first place. The rancher who'd survived a dozen storms had genuine, hard-won reasons to believe he understood what he was facing. He simply hadn't yet lived through the one storm designed to prove that understanding wrong. Joseph Kessler occupied uncomfortable middle ground in this pattern. 3 years into frontier life, he'd developed enough confidence to string a rope to the barn and trust it completely, but not quite enough seasoning to recognize the specific signs that should have kept him inside that afternoon. He was neither a cautious newcomer nor an overconfident veteran, and that middle position, as it turned out, offered no particular protection at all. There was perhaps a crueler irony still buried in this pattern. The very precautions that experienced settlers built over years, the ropes, the marked trails, the practiced routines for reaching a barn in bad weather, gave men like Joseph just enough false confidence to step outside in conditions a total newcomer might have refused to face at all. A man with no rope and no experience might simply stay inside out of pure fear, and that fear, however unearned, would have kept him alive. Joseph's careful preparation, the very thing that should have protected him, became the reason he trusted himself to step through that door in the first place. There's a deeper layer here too, one that rarely appears in the sanitized version of frontier history taught in most classrooms. Native peoples of the region, including Dakota and Lakota communities who had lived on these plains for countless generations before any European settler arrived, possessed extensive knowledge of weather patterns that white settlers largely dismissed or never bothered to seek out. Oral histories passed through these communities describe specific signs that preceded severe storms, shifts in animal behavior, particular qualities of light and air pressure, patterns in bird migration that experienced observers could read with real accuracy. This knowledge hadn't developed by accident. Generations of survival on the same stretch of plains, unmediated by European farming techniques or European assumptions about how weather ought to behave, had produced a body of understanding suited specifically to this land, refined and passed down long before any homestead claim was ever filed. A sudden stillness in the grass, a certain heaviness to the air, birds moving with unusual urgency toward whatever shelter they could find. These were not superstitions, but patterns observed and confirmed across countless winters, knowledge as legitimate and hard-earned as anything a German farmer knew about frost dates or planting seasons back home. Settlers arriving from Germany, Norway and Sweden had no access to generations of accumulated local knowledge, and the rapid, often violent displacement of native communities from this same territory throughout the preceding decades had already fractured many of the relationships through which that knowledge might otherwise have passed between peoples. Some scattered accounts do describe native individuals warning nearby settler families in the hours before the storm hit, urging them to bring in livestock and prepare for something severe, warnings that were occasionally heeded and occasionally ignored entirely, dismissed as superstition by settlers who trusted European farming instincts, over knowledge rooted in this specific land. The tragedy inside this tragedy is difficult to overstate. A body of knowledge existed, refined over centuries, capable of reading exactly the kind of danger that struck on January 7th, and the same colonial policies that had pushed native communities onto reservations and away from ancestral territory had also severed the channels through which that knowledge could have reached the newcomers who needed it most. This wasn't simple bad luck. It was the direct, if unintended, consequence of a settlement system built on separation rather than exchange. This complicates any simple story about frontier winter as purely a battle between humans and nature. It was also, quietly and less visibly, a story about which knowledge got trusted, which got dismissed, and how much unnecessary death resulted from a young settler society's refusal to learn from the people who understood this particular ground better than anyone. None of this history occupied Anna Kessler's mind on the afternoon of January 7th. She knew only what her own 3 years on this land had taught her, and what her own 3 years had taught her was proving entirely insufficient for what was happening outside her window. Joseph had been gone for well over an hour now. The rope she could see through the frosted glass, taut and disappearing into white, had stopped moving 20 minutes earlier. She was about to face a choice that would strip away every assumption she'd carried onto this land about safety, about caution, about what a person owed to someone they loved when the entire world had turned against both of them at once. The rope went slack. Anna saw it happen through the frosted glass, a small give in the taut line that told her everything and nothing at once. She didn't know if Joseph had let go on purpose, tying off somewhere along the way, or if the rope had simply broken under the weight of ice building along its length. She only knew the line no longer moved. Her heart was already pounding before she made the decision. Her hands were already reaching for her coat before her mind had fully agreed to what she was about to do. Some part of her, the part that had survived a landlord, an ocean, and a buried daughter, understood that waiting any longer meant waiting too long. She wrapped a second wool shawl over her coat. She tied a length of rope from the doorframe around her own waist, a crude second lifeline in case the first one failed her too. She opened the door. The wind hit her like a wall, not a gust, not a gale, something closer to a solid physical force that nearly knocked her backward into her own home. Snow filled her mouth and nose in an instant, so fine and so fast it felt less like weather and more like drowning. She could not see the barn. She could not see her own outstretched hand. She could see nothing at all except a churning, screaming whiteness that seemed to have swallowed the entire world beyond her doorstep. This was the moment, replicated across hundreds of homesteads scattered through Dakota and Nebraska territory that same afternoon, when people first understood the scale of what they were facing. Not a bad storm, something else entirely. Telegraph operators in towns along the rail line were the first to grasp how widespread the disaster had become, watching reports arrive from stations 100 miles apart describing identical conditions, identical temperature drops, identical walls of snow arriving within the same narrow window of hours. A storm system that size had never been recorded in the territory's short history of American settlement. Weather observers working for the newly formed National Weather Service, still in its infancy and barely a year old, would later trace the storm to a rare collision of Arctic air plunging down from Canada, meeting warm, moisture-laden air pushing up from the Gulf of Mexico, a collision violent enough to produce conditions that broke every prediction model available at the time. None of that mattered to the people living through it. What mattered was survival, minute by minute, breath by breath. Word of the storm's ferocity travelled through the territory in fragments, carried by whoever managed to reach a neighbour or a town before conditions made travel entirely impossible. A rider heading toward the county seat that morning to file paperwork on a land claim turned back within a mile. his horse refusing to walk further into wind that had begun driving ice crystals hard enough to draw blood from exposed skin. He made it home only because he had had the good sense to turn around at the first sign of trouble, a decision that likely saved his life, and one he would describe for the rest of his years as the only wise choice he made all winter. In the town of Yankton, 70 miles from the Kessler homestead, a doctor named Elias Reinhold watched his thermometer readings with growing alarm through the afternoon, recording a drop of nearly 50 degrees in 9 hours, a collapse in temperature so severe he initially assumed his instrument had malfunctioned. He sent a boy running through town to warn families to bring in anyone still outside, a warning that reached perhaps half the households before the storm made the streets themselves impossible to navigate. Reinhold later wrote in a letter to a colleague back east that he'd never witnessed weather behave with such deliberate, almost personal cruelty, timing its worst fury for the exact hour when the greatest number of people were caught furthest from shelter. Sophie Lindqvist, the young schoolteacher who dismissed her students an hour before the temperature collapsed, realised her mistake within minutes of watching the sky outside her boarding house window. She grabbed a lantern and a length of clothesline and went out after them, following the same road her students would have taken, calling names into a wind that swallowed her voice before it travelled 10 feet. She found 3 children huddled together against a fence post less than half a mile from the schoolhouse, disoriented and already shivering uncontrollably, and got them turned back toward shelter through sheer force of will and a desperate, half-remembered sense of direction. 2 other children from her class were not found that day. Anna pushed forward along her rope, one hand sliding along the frozen fibre, the other held up against her face in a useless attempt to shield her eyes from snow that felt less like snow and more like shards of ice hurled with real force. Her fingers had gone numb within minutes. Her eyelashes had frozen together, crusted with ice that she had to work loose with a numbed thumb just to see anything at all. 10 feet. 20. She had no way to measure the distance except in the aching burn spreading through her hands and the growing panic that she might have already passed the barn without knowing it. Her mind raced through the layout of her own farm, a layout she'd walked so many times it should have been automatic. The well should be somewhere off to her left, the chicken coop somewhere ahead, and slightly right. None of it helped, because none of it could be seen, and a mental map was worthless against a world that had erased every visual reference it depended on. She fought the urge to call out for Joseph, knowing the wind would swallow her voice before it travelled 10 feet, saving her breath instead for the fight against the cold itself. This was the terrifying mathematics of the Great Blizzard of 1873, the same mathematics playing out simultaneously across 2 territories and part of a third. A person could travel the exact route they'd walked 1,000 times and still become completely, hopelessly lost within the first 100 feet, because the storm didn't just reduce visibility, it erased every landmark a mind relied on to know where it stood in space. Reports gathered in the following weeks would document cattle herds found frozen in massive drifted piles against fence lines dozens of miles from where they'd started, ranchers and hired hands caught between properties and never found, until the spring thaw finally released what the snow had hidden. Entire families discovered huddled together in root cellars or storm cellars. Some who'd made it, some who hadn't survived the cold that seeped through even the most carefully sealed shelter. The storm did not relent as darkness fell. If anything, the wind grew worse through the night, temperatures continuing their collapse toward levels that would eventually be recorded as low as 40 degrees below zero across parts of the affected territory. Snowdrifts building against homes and barns reached heights that would bury entire structures by morning, trapping some families inside their own homes for days once the wind finally died down enough to let anyone dig their way back out. In one township south of the Kessler farm, An entire family of 6 survived by huddling together beneath a pile of quilts and coats in a single room, feeding their stove with furniture broken apart board by board once the hay basket ran empty sometime after midnight. A neighbouring family, less fortunate, lost their youngest child to cold that crept through walls never designed to withstand a storm of this magnitude, a loss the mother would describe decades later as the single defining sorrow of her long life on the frontier. Stories like these multiplied by the dozens across the territory that night, each household facing its own private, isolated version of the same terrifying arithmetic: fuel against time, warmth against wind, hope against a storm that showed no sign of slowing. Anna's outstretched hand finally found something solid. Wood, rough and half buried under a crust of ice, the barn wall. She followed it, hand over hand, fighting a wind that seemed determined to peel her away from the one solid thing she'd found in an otherwise featureless world, until her fingers closed around the barn door's iron latch. She pulled it open and stumbled inside, into a darkness that felt, for one desperate moment, exactly as cold and exactly as dangerous as the storm she'd just escaped. "Joseph!" Her voice came out smaller than she intended, swallowed almost immediately by the wind still screaming against the barn's outer walls. She called again, louder this time, forcing air past a throat already raw from cold. Somewhere in the darkness ahead of her, past the shapes of the 2 milk cows huddled together against the far wall, something moved. Warm breath, low and steady, brushed against Anna's outstretched hand before she understood what she was touching. Not Joseph. The 3rd cow, the young heifer they'd bought in the fall, had wandered loose from its stall and pressed itself against the barn wall for warmth, exactly where a man shape might be mistaken for an animal's in absolute darkness. Anna's relief collapsed into fresh panic within the same breath, because if Joseph wasn't here, in the one place his rope was supposed to lead him, then she had no idea where in this vast, howling nothing her husband actually was. That uncertainty, multiplied across hundreds of homesteads that night, traced back to something far larger than any single family's misfortune. 2 years before the Great Blizzard of 1873 struck, railroad companies operating across Nebraska and Dakota Territory had launched an aggressive campaign to fill the land grants Congress had awarded them along their new rail lines. The Northern Pacific and other lines received millions of acres from the federal government as incentive to build track across the northern plains, and that land was worthless to a railroad company unless people actually settled it, farmed it, and shipped goods along those very rails. Filling that land meant recruiting settlers, and recruiting settlers meant advertising. And advertising meant painting a picture of the Dakota and Nebraska frontier that bore only a passing resemblance to the truth. Pamphlets printed in German, Norwegian, Swedish and Danish flooded villages across northern Europe throughout the early 1870s, distributed by paid agents who received a commission for every family they successfully convinced to emigrate. These pamphlets described a climate gentler and milder than anything these farmers had ever known, comparing the northern plains favourably to regions of France or southern Germany, emphasising rich soil and abundant rainfall while remaining almost entirely silent on the subject of winter. When winter did appear in these documents at all, it was described in passing, a brief cold season, no more severe than what a Bavarian farmer might already expect. Nothing to suggest the reality of temperatures plunging to 40 below zero, or storms capable of killing a grown man within sight of his own door. Some pamphlets went further still, including illustrations of prosperous farmsteads surrounded by green fields under warm, cloudless skies, images commissioned specifically to accompany the recruitment campaign and bearing almost no resemblance to the actual landscape awaiting new arrivals. A handful of surviving letters from settlers who arrived in the years just before the blizzard describe a shared sense of quiet betrayal upon seeing their first Dakota winter, a realization that the paradise promised in a Hamburg meeting hall existed nowhere on the actual map they'd been sold. By the time most families understood the gap between promise and reality, they had already sold their previous homes, spent their savings on passage and initial supplies, and filed claims requiring 5 years of continuous residence to secure ownership. Turning back was rarely a real option, whatever the winters actually delivered. This wasn't ignorance on the railroad company's part. Officials within these companies had access to weather records collected by military outposts and early government surveys, data that made clear just how brutal winters on the northern plains could become. That information simply never made it into the promotional pamphlets, because accurate weather reporting was bad for business. And business, in the years following the Civil War, drove nearly every decision made about how the American West would be settled. Land agents worked on commission, paid a set amount for every family who purchased acreage or filed a homestead claim through their office. That commission structure created a direct financial incentive to downplay every hardship and inflate every promise, an incentive that operated independently of any single agent's personal honesty or dishonesty. Even agents who genuinely believed they were helping desperate European farmers build better lives operated inside a system that rewarded optimism and punished caution. A system where telling the whole truth about Dakota winters would have meant fewer families signing contracts and fewer commissions collected at the end of each month. Some agents kept private ledgers, later uncovered by territorial historians, showing bonuses paid for particularly large groups of emigrants recruited from a single village, a structure that turned entire communities into commodities moved wholesale from one continent to another. One agent working the region around Hanover, the same region Joseph Kessler called home, was documented recruiting more than 60 families in a single year, each one representing a payment tied directly to how convincingly he could describe a future that didn't exist. There is no record that this particular agent ever set foot on the Dakota plains himself, no evidence he had any first-hand knowledge of the winters he was so confidently describing to frightened, hopeful farmers half a world away. Joseph Kessler had first learned about America from exactly this kind of pamphlet, passed hand to hand through his village outside Hanover by a neighbour whose cousin had already emigrated the year before. He'd made his decision to leave Germany based on promises of mild winters and abundant land, promises crafted by men in offices hundreds of miles from the plains those men were selling, men who would never spend a single night inside a soddy during a blizzard like the one now burying half the territory in snow. The federal government bore its own share of responsibility in this hidden layer of the story, though in a different form than the railroads. The National Weather Service, established under the Army Signal Corps only a year before the Great Blizzard struck, remained desperately underfunded and understaffed, relying on a small handful of observation stations scattered across enormous stretches of territory. Telegraph lines connecting these stations to the rural communities that needed warnings most simply didn't exist in most of Dakota and Nebraska territory, meaning even accurate weather predictions, when they existed at all, had no practical way of reaching an isolated homestead like the Kesslers in time to matter. A young lieutenant assigned to a Signal Corps station in Omaha had actually noted unusual barometric pressure readings on the morning of January 7th, recognizing the signs of a potentially severe weather system forming to the northwest. He sent a telegraph warning to several larger towns along the rail line, a warning that reached newspaper offices and train depots within hours. That warning never reached the scattered rural households living miles from any telegraph office, households that made up the overwhelming majority of the territory's population, Households like the Kesslers, who had no way of knowing that a government official more than 100 miles away had already seen this storm coming. The gap between what institutions knew and what ordinary families knew wasn't an accident of geography alone. Telegraph lines followed rail lines, and rail lines followed the routes most profitable to the companies building them, which meant entire counties of homesteaded farmland sat well outside any realistic warning network at all. A newspaper editor in one Nebraska town later wrote, with evident bitterness, that his own office had received word of the coming storm nearly 6 hours before it struck, time enough to warn perhaps 100 families within walking distance of town, while thousands more scattered across the surrounding countryside received no warning whatsoever until the sky itself delivered it. He called it, in a phrase that stuck with territorial newspapers for years afterward, a warning system built for towns in a territory made almost entirely of farms. This is the quiet, uncomfortable truth beneath the great blizzard of 1873. It wasn't only a natural disaster. It was also the predictable outcome of a settlement system built on financial incentives that rewarded silence over honesty, and an early warning infrastructure that existed only for the people who needed it least. The rural poor, the newest immigrants, the families scattered across the most isolated stretches of prairie, were precisely the people least likely to receive any warning at all, even as institutions closer to power had already begun to understand what was coming. This system remained entirely invisible to the very families it endangered. Anna and Joseph never met the men who'd painted those pamphlet illustrations, never learned the name of the agent who'd recruited them, never knew that a lieutenant in Omaha had spotted trouble on his instruments hours before their own sky began to change. The machinery that shaped their fate operated entirely out of sight, leaving them to face its consequences alone on 160 acres of borrowed land, with nothing between them and a collapsing sky but a rope, a barn, and whatever courage they had left. None of this history offered Anna Kessler any comfort as she stood in her darkened barn, one hand still resting on the heifer's warm flank, her husband nowhere to be found. She had no way of knowing about pamphlets or commissions or a telegraph warning sent to Omaha that morning. She only knew that the barn, her one hope, had failed to hold the answer she needed, and that somewhere out in that screaming whiteness, Joseph was still missing, and every passing minute made his chances of survival smaller than the one before it. She would have to go back out. The heifer's warm breath was the only comfort Anna Kessler had left in that barn, and it wasn't enough. She stood there for perhaps 10 seconds, feeling the cold already working its way back through her wet wool, and understood with total clarity that 10 seconds was all she could afford to waste. Joseph wasn't here. That meant he was somewhere between the house and the barn, or somewhere past the barn entirely, in a stretch of open pasture that offered nothing to catch a lost man and turn him back towards safety. Anna untied the rope from her waist, looped it instead around the barn door's iron latch, and knotted it as tightly as her numbed fingers could manage. She had perhaps 80 feet of rope remaining, enough to search a rough half-circle around the barn if she moved carefully, staying always within reach of that single tether back to a fixed point. It wasn't much of a plan. It was the only one she had. She stepped back out into the storm. The wind had not weakened at all in the time she'd spent inside the barn, and if anything, the cold now felt sharper, working faster through clothing already soaked from her first trip out. She called Joseph's name into the screaming white, knowing the sound would travel almost nowhere, knowing she was doing it anyway because the alternative was silence, and silence felt like giving up before she'd truly tried. She moved along the rope's length in a slow arc, one hand sliding along the taut line, the other sweeping through the air and snow in front of her in wide, desperate sweeps, searching for anything solid, anything that wasn't simply more snow. The cold had already begun working past her wet wool into her skin, a deep ache that had started in her fingers and was now creeping up through her wrists, and she forced herself not to think about how much longer her own body could withstand this before she became a second person this storm needed to claim. Every few feet she stopped, listened for anything beneath the wind's constant roar. A voice, a groan, anything that might mean Yosef was closer than she dared hope. Her foot caught on something soft. She dropped to her knees immediately, hands scrabbling through snow already several inches deep at this spot, and found fabric. Then an arm, then Yosef's face, turned half sideways against the ground, eyes open but unfocused, snow already collecting in his eyelashes and beginning to melt against skin that felt disturbingly, terrifyingly warm to the touch. Joseph. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his words came slow and slurred, stretched out in a way that made her chest tighten with a fear sharper than anything the cold itself had produced. "So warm," he said. "Anna, it's so warm out here." She understood in that instant exactly what she was looking at. She'd heard the old-timers talk about it, men who'd survived enough winters to know the signs. A story passed between neighbours about a settler, 2 counties over, who'd been found half undressed in a snowbank, having stripped away his own coat in his final confused minutes, utterly convinced he was burning rather than freezing. Joseph's coat was still on, but his collar had been pulled open, his scarf half unwound and trailing loose in the snow beside him, his hands, when she grabbed them, bare and already alarmingly cold, gloves nowhere to be found. He'd started down that same terrible path. She had perhaps minutes to pull him back from it. Anna hauled at his arm with strength she didn't know she had left, screaming his name now, screaming at him to stand, to move, to fight whatever warm, seductive calm his freezing brain was feeding him. He resisted at first, mumbling something about the sun, about how strange it was that the sun felt so warm on a day this cold, and Anna understood that reasoning with him would accomplish nothing at all. She slapped him, hard across the face, harder than she had ever struck another human being in her life, and something in that shock seemed to cut briefly through whatever fog had settled over him. His eyes focused, just for a moment, on her face, and some flicker of recognition crossed them. "Up," she said. "Now, Joseph, now." Between her strength and whatever will he had left to draw on, they got him to his knees, then unsteadily to his feet, his full weight leaning against her shoulder in a way that nearly buckled her legs beneath both of them. She found the rope with her free hand and began the slow, agonizing process of following it back toward the barn, half dragging, half guiding a man whose legs kept giving out beneath him, whose words kept drifting back toward that dangerous, warm confusion whenever she let more than a few seconds pass in silence. She talked to him the entire way, not because she expected him to respond, but because the sound of her own voice seemed to be the only thing keeping him tethered to reality at all. She talked about their daughter, the one they'd buried, a subject neither of them ever raised voluntarily, because she needed something sharp enough to cut through his confusion, something that mattered enough to hold his attention even in the state he was in. She talked about Germany, about his mother's kitchen, about the ridiculous rooster that used to wake the whole village at dawn. She talked, and she pulled, and somehow, impossibly, the barn door finally came into her searching hand. Getting him inside the barn wasn't safety, not truly, not with the temperature inside barely better than outside and no fire to warm him. But it was shelter from the wind, and the wind, she understood now with a clarity that would stay with her for the rest of her life, had been the true killer all along, stripping heat from her body faster than cold, alone ever could. She stripped off her own outer shawl, already half frozen, and wrapped it around Yosef's exposed hands, rubbing them between her own in movements that felt more like desperation than any deliberate first aid. She pressed her body against his in the dark, sharing what warmth she had left, refusing to let herself think about how much of her own strength she'd already spent, how far the house still was, how the storm outside showed no sign of relenting. Yosef's words slowly grew clearer as the minutes passed, the dangerous warm confusion retreating as his body, still cold but no longer catastrophically so, began to understand its actual situation again. The rope, he finally managed, his voice raw but coherent now. It broke. I couldn't find my way back. I know, Anna said. I found you. They stayed in that barn through the worst hours of the night, huddled together with the 3 cows for whatever body heat the animals could offer, Anna refusing sleep even as exhaustion pulled at every part of her, terrified that closing her eyes even briefly might mean losing Yosef to the same confusion that had nearly claimed him in the snow. She kept talking through those long hours, quieter now, less urgent, simply keeping her voice moving through the dark so that Joseph would have something familiar to hold on to if his mind started drifting again. She told him about the spring, about the wheat they'd plant once the ground thawed, about the modest wooden house they might build someday to replace the soddy, small promises about a future neither of them could be entirely certain they'd survive to see. Joseph's breathing evened out gradually beside her, still shallow but steady, and every hour that passed without his words slurring again felt like a small, hard-won victory against a night that had already tried to take him from her once. The cows shifted occasionally in the dark, their bodies pressed close enough that Anna could feel each slow breath rising and falling against her side, and she found herself grateful, in a way she'd never expected to feel toward livestock, for the simple heat 3 living animals could provide 2 freezing, exhausted people. Somewhere past midnight the wind began almost imperceptibly to ease. It would be hours still before either of them could risk the walk back to the house. Hours of huddling in a freezing barn, rationing what little warmth 2 exhausted, half-frozen bodies could produce between them. But Joseph was alive. Anna had gone out into a storm that had already killed dozens of people across the territory that same night, and she had brought her husband back. Whatever this land asked of her in the years still to come, she now knew something about herself that she hadn't fully understood before stepping through that door. She was capable of far more than she'd ever imagined, and that knowledge, however hard won, would carry her through every hardship still waiting on the other side of this brutal, unforgiving winter. A phone screen glowed in a dark living room in Austin, Texas, on a February night in 2021, its battery dropping fast because the power had been out for hours and there was nothing left to charge it with. A woman named nobody in particular, one of millions across the state that week, sat wrapped in every blanket she owned, watching that battery percentage fall the way Anna Kessler once watched a fire burn down to its last coals. Outside, the temperature had dropped into single digits, a number that would have sounded absurd to most Texans a week earlier. The kind of cold the region simply didn't plan for, because the region had never truly needed to. That's the thread connecting a Dakota soddy in 1873 to a modern Texas living room 148 years later. Not the technology, not the century, the particular specific danger of trusting a system built for ordinary weather when extraordinary weather finally arrives. Winter Storm Uri struck Texas in February of 2021, dropping temperatures across the state to levels not seen in decades, and within days, the state's power grid, a system operated independently from the rest of the national electrical network, began failing on a massive scale. Natural gas wellheads froze. Power plants, never designed or winterized for extreme cold because extreme cold in Texas was considered a rare enough event not to justify the expense, went offline one after another. Millions of Texans lost power for days, some for nearly a week, in temperatures cold enough to kill. More than 200 people died in that storm, according to official state counts, though independent researchers later suggested the true number was likely much higher. Deaths from hypothermia, from carbon monoxide poisoning after families ran generators or car engines indoors trying to stay warm, from failed medical equipment that depended on electricity to keep people alive. Entire families were found dead in homes with no power and no way to reach help, some of them only miles from hospitals that had electricity and heat the entire time. Rural counties, much like the rural counties of Dakota Territory in 1873, often fared worst of all. Cities with denser populations and more concentrated infrastructure sometimes restored power within a day or two, while isolated homes on the outskirts of small towns waited far longer, cut off by the same geography that had always made them harder to reach, harder to prioritize, harder to see from the perspective of anyone managing the crisis from a control room hundreds of miles away. An elderly couple outside a small town in the Texas Hill Country was found nearly a week after the storm began. Having survived on canned food and blankets in a house with no heat, their nearest neighbour more than a mile down an unploughed road that emergency crews couldn't reach until the worst of the crisis had already passed. The parallel to the winter of 1873 isn't a stretch. It's almost uncomfortably exact. In both cases, a system optimized for ordinary conditions collapsed the moment conditions turned extraordinary. In both cases, the people who suffered most were rarely the ones with the power to fix the underlying problem. In both cases, warnings existed somewhere in the system, weather forecasts, grid stress reports, historical data suggesting this kind of cold was possible, and those warnings simply failed to translate into meaningful protection for the people who needed it most. Texas grid operators had been warned as far back as 2011, following a smaller winter storm that caused rolling blackouts across the state, that the system remained vulnerable to exactly this kind of extreme cold event. Recommendations were made. Winterization standards were proposed. Most of those recommendations were never implemented, in part because winterizing power infrastructure cost money, and the state's deregulated energy market provided little financial incentive for companies to spend heavily preparing for an event most executives considered unlikely to occur again anytime soon. Federal regulators issued similar warnings after cold snaps in other years too, each report landing on desks in offices far from the rural counties and struggling neighborhoods that would eventually bear the worst consequences of inaction. The math driving those decisions wasn't complicated, and it wasn't unique to Texas either. Spending money to prepare for an unlikely event competes directly against short-term profit, and in a system where no single company bears full responsibility for the grid's overall reliability, it becomes remarkably easy for necessary investment to simply never happen, year after year, until the unlikely event finally arrives. That sentence should sound familiar by now. It's the same sentence that could describe railroad land agents in the 1870s, weighing the cost of the honest weather reporting against the profit of continued immigration and choosing profit. It's the same sentence that could describe a young Signal Corps lieutenant whose accurate warning reached towns along a rail line but never reached the rural households who needed it most, because building that infrastructure everywhere would have cost more than anyone was willing to spend on people considered acceptable losses. Ask yourself honestly, sitting wherever you are right now, warm and connected to a power grid you've probably never thought twice about. If the systems you depend on every single day failed simultaneously during the single worst week of weather your region has ever recorded, how many hours would pass before anyone with real authority even noticed you were in danger? Most Americans in 2026 assume the infrastructure surrounding them, power, heat, emergency alerts sent directly to a phone in every pocket, represents a kind of permanent safety net that people in 1873 simply didn't have access to. That assumption isn't entirely wrong. Modern infrastructure has genuinely saved countless lives that would have been lost under frontier conditions. But Urey proved, in painfully specific terms, that modern infrastructure carries its own version of the same vulnerability that killed settlers on the Dakota Plains a century and a half earlier. A system built around an assumption of normal conditions, tested and found wanting the moment conditions stopped being normal. The families who died in Texas in 2021 weren't reckless. They weren't unprepared in any way a reasonable person would have anticipated needing to prepare. They trusted a system that had for decades delivered heat and power through every winter they'd ever lived through, exactly the same way Anna and Joseph Kessler trusted a rope, a familiar walk to a barn, and 3 years of accumulated experience on land they believed they understood. That trust wasn't foolish in either case. It was simply insufficient for the one event neither system had been built to survive. There's a particular kind of American optimism running through both stories, a belief that systems, once built, will hold, that infrastructure represents progress moving only in one direction, toward greater safety, greater reliability, greater protection from the raw unpredictability of nature. The Great Blizzard of 1873 punctured that optimism for one generation of settlers. Winter Storm Uri punctured it again for an entirely different generation, nearly a century and a half later, proving that the gap between what a system promises and what a system actually delivers under extreme stress never fully closes, no matter how advanced that system becomes. Anna Kessler had no power grid to fail her, no emergency alert system, no weather app buzzing a warning 12 hours before disaster struck. She had a rope, a barn, and whatever courage and clear thinking she could summon in the worst hour of her life. In some strange, uncomfortable way that made her situation more honest than ours. She knew exactly how thin the margin of safety really was, because she could see it, feel it, measure it in baskets of hay and lengths of rope. Modern Americans, wrapped in the comfort of systems that mostly work, rarely have to confront that same honest reckoning with how thin their own margin of safety actually is, until the 1 week a year when the system fails and the truth becomes impossible to ignore. That gap between comfort and reality is worth sitting with for a moment, because it's the same gap that swallowed a Nebraska rancher 3 years wiser than his neighbors, and the same gap that left a Texas family without heat in a storm their entire infrastructure insisted could never happen. Maybe the honest lesson sitting underneath both stories isn't about grids or ropes or pamphlets at all. Maybe it's simply this, that every generation builds its own version of false confidence, dressed in whatever technology or experience that generation happens to trust most, and every generation eventually meets the one event designed specifically to prove that confidence wrong. The frontier called it a blizzard. We call it a grid failure, a supply chain collapse, a 100-year flood arriving twice in a single decade. The name changes. The underlying shape of the danger, a system trusted right up until the moment it fails. Everyone who depended on it has never really changed at all. A stack of yellowed county ledgers sits today in a state historical archive in South Dakota. Their pages brittle enough that researchers handle them with cotton gloves, ink faded to a pale brown that grows harder to read with every passing decade. Somewhere inside those pages is the true death toll of the Great Blizzard of 1873, a number historians have argued over for more than a century without ever reaching full agreement. Some entries in these ledgers list only a surname and a rough location, a family recorded as missing from a claim with no further detail about how many people that family actually contained. Others are more thorough, listing names, approximate ages, and cause of death in a clerk's careful handwriting. though even these more detailed entries often rely on second-hand accounts from neighbours rather than any formal medical examination. A county coroner working alone across hundreds of square miles simply couldn't reach every claim, every isolated soddy, every scattered family in the weeks following a disaster this widespread, and many deaths were confirmed only when spring thaw finally revealed what winter snow had hidden. The official count most commonly cited puts the number of dead somewhere between 200 and 300 people across Nebraska, Dakota Territory, and parts of Minnesota and Iowa. Some researchers examining incomplete county records and accounting for isolated deaths that likely went unreported entirely believe the real number could be considerably higher, possibly reaching 400 or 500 once undocumented cases are factored in. Frontier record-keeping in 1873 was inconsistent at best, dependent on local coroners and county clerks whose thoroughness varied enormously from one township to the next, and entire families who died together on isolated claims sometimes weren't discovered or recorded until months later, if they were recorded at all. This uncertainty isn't a minor footnote. It represents a genuine, unresolved question that historians studying frontier disasters continue to debate. How do we accurately measure suffering that occurred in places with no reliable system for measuring it? The same uncertainty extends to a much harder question, one that contemporaries argued about bitterly in the weeks and months following the storm, and one that historians still don't fully agree on today. Who, if anyone, bears real responsibility for a death toll this high? Some newspaper editors writing in the storm's immediate aftermath placed blame squarely on the railroad companies and their aggressive immigration campaigns, arguing that recruiting vulnerable European farmers with false promises of mild winters amounted to a kind of reckless endangerment, profit prioritized over honest disclosure of real risk. These critics pointed directly at the pamphlets, the paid agents, the illustrations of green fields under gentle skies, arguing that a settlement system built on deception bore direct moral responsibility for the deaths that resulted when reality finally caught up with the marketing. One territorial newspaper ran an editorial just weeks after the storm, demanding that railroad companies be held legally accountable for what it called deliberate misrepresentation of the climate awaiting new settlers, a demand that gained some public sympathy, but never translated into any formal legal consequence for the companies involved. No railroad executive was ever charged with wrongdoing in connection with the deaths, and the immigration campaigns themselves continued largely unchanged in the years that followed, adjusted only slightly to include vaguer, more defensible language about seasonal weather, rather than any substantive change in how honestly winter conditions were described. Other voices at the time pushed back hard against that framing. Settlers themselves, in letters and testimonies collected in the years following the disaster, frequently rejected the idea that they'd been simply deceived or victimized. Many insisted they'd understood, at least in general terms, that American winters could be harsh, and that their decision to emigrate had been a calculated risk they'd accepted with open eyes, not a trap sprung on unsuspecting innocents by scheming railroad agents. This perspective argued that assigning blame to distant institutions robbed frontier settlers of their own agency, treating them as passive victims of deception, rather than active participants who'd weighed real risks against a real opportunity and made their own informed choice. A surviving letter from a Norwegian settler in a neighbouring county, written to relatives back home the following spring, captured this view plainly, insisting that no one had forced his family onto this land, and that whatever hardship the winter had brought, it remained preferable to a life of guaranteed poverty as a tenant farmer under a landlord who would never let them own a single acre of their own. That perspective didn't deny the tragedy. It simply refused to frame the people who endured it as helpless victims rather than as settlers who'd made a difficult, deliberate bet on a harder but freer life. A third perspective, gaining more traction among historians in recent decades, points toward the federal government's failed warning infrastructure as the more direct and preventable cause of death, arguing that accurate information existed within the system well before the storm struck, and that the true failure wasn't deception, but simple neglect. A young nation unwilling to invest in the infrastructure needed to protect its most isolated citizens. This view holds railroad companies and land agents responsible for creating dangerous incentives, certainly, but places the sharper moral failure on a government that possessed real warning data and simply lacked the will or resources to distribute it to the people who needed it most. Historians who study the specific dynamics of frontier settlement have also raised a more uncomfortable question still, one that resists easy resolution. Was the entire system of westward expansion, built as it was on land taken from native nations and marketed aggressively to desperate immigrants across Europe, a system that was always going to produce tragedies like this one, regardless of any individual failure or decision along the way? Under this reading, the Great Blizzard of 1873 wasn't a preventable accident within an otherwise sound system. It was a predictable consequence of a system built, from its foundation, on treating human lives as acceptable costs of rapid territorial expansion. Other historians resist that framing as too deterministic, arguing that it erases the genuine agency and resilience of the individual families who chose this life, who built real communities and real futures on this land despite its dangers, and who cannot simply be reduced to victims of a flawed system without acknowledging their own choices, their own hopes, and their own reasons for staying even after tragedy struck. There's no clean resolution to any of this. Reasonable historians examining the same documents and the same testimonies continue to reach different conclusions about where responsibility truly lies. Some emphasize systemic failure, others emphasize individual agency and calculated risk. Still others argue the entire framework of assigning blame misses the deeper point, that frontier life simply carried irreducible danger. No system, however well designed, could have fully eliminated. Anna Kessler never wrote down her own opinion on any of this, at least not in any letter or document that survives today. What we do know, from the sparse historical record that does exist about families like hers, is that most survivors carried a complicated mix of gratitude and grief that resists any single tidy narrative. Grateful to be alive, grieving those who weren't, uncertain whether to blame the land, the railroad, the government, or simply the unknowable nature of weather itself, and often choosing, in the end, not to spend their remaining years assigning blame at all, but simply to keep going, to plant the next crop, to rebuild what the storm had taken. Maybe that's the most honest place to leave this debate, not with an answer, but with the same open question that families living through it were left holding. When a disaster this large strikes a system built from dozens of separate decisions, made by dozens of separate people and institutions, none of whom ever met each other, is there truly a single place responsibility can rest? Or does tragedy this size simply refuse the kind of clean accounting we instinctively want to impose on it, scattering blame across so many hands that no single one ever has to bear the full weight of what happened? Historians will likely keep arguing about this for as long as anyone continues studying the American frontier. Some new piece of correspondence, some rediscovered county ledger, some re-examined survivor testimony occasionally shifts the balance of the debate slightly one direction or the other, without ever fully resolving it. That may simply be the nature of history this old and this incomplete, a permanent argument rather than a settled verdict, revisited by each new generation of researchers with slightly different questions and slightly different evidence. What almost no one disputes, whatever side of this debate they land on, is what came next for the families who survived, and how profoundly this single storm reshaped the world those survivors went on to build. Saplings, no taller than a man's knee, stood in careful rows across a stretch of Dakota prairie that spring, staked against the wind with strips of cloth, planted by families who had never once considered a tree worth this much deliberate effort before that January. Anna Kessler helped plant a row of cottonwood and box elder along the western edge of the Kessler, claim that April, her hands still bearing faint scars from frostbite she'd suffered searching for Joseph months earlier, pressing each fragile root into soil that had nearly buried her husband alive. Those saplings weren't decoration, they were policy, given physical form. In March of 1873, only weeks after the storm that killed hundreds across Nebraska, Dakota Territory, and neighboring regions, Congress passed the Timber Culture Act, a law offering settlers an additional 160 acres of land if they successfully planted and maintained at least 10 acres of trees over a period of years. The law had been under discussion before the blizzard struck, driven partly by concerns about lumber shortages and partly by a widespread, if scientifically shaky, belief that planting trees could actually influence rainfall and moderate the harsh climate of the open plains. But the timing mattered enormously. A storm that had just demonstrated, in the most brutal terms possible, exactly what open, treeless country could do to human life, gave the Timber Culture Act a sudden, urgent relevance it might not have carried in a milder year. Land Office records from Dakota and Nebraska Territory show a sharp increase in timber culture claims filed in the months immediately following the blizzard. Families who had previously shown little interest in the extra effort of tree planting, suddenly willing to invest years of labour into rows of saplings that offered no immediate harvest and no immediate profit. The math was simple enough for anyone who'd lived through January of 1873 to understand, without needing a government pamphlet to explain it. A few acres of trees represented the difference between a farm that could break the worst of a prairie wind and one that stood entirely exposed to whatever the sky decided to send. Windbreaks planted under this law wouldn't have stopped a storm as severe as the one in January of 1873, and honest agricultural officials of the era knew it. But rows of trees planted along property lines and around homesteads did measurably reduce the ferocity of ordinary winter winds, cutting down on lesser storms that, year after year, still claimed lives and livestock across the plains. Over the following decades, thousands of homestead families took up tree planting not just for the promised additional acreage, but out of a hard-earned understanding that bare, open ground offered nothing between a family and whatever weather decided to arrive. The storm also reshaped how rural communities across the affected territories thought about schools. County school boards across Nebraska and Dakota Territory, confronted with the deaths of children caught between schoolhouses and home, began adopting formal policies in the years immediately following the blizzard, rules requiring schools to maintain emergency fuel and blanket supplies, and guidelines instructing teachers to keep children inside during uncertain weather rather than dismissing early based on morning conditions that might change without warning. Some of these policies were informal at first, agreed upon at township meetings rather than written into any official code, but by the 1880s, several territorial school districts had codified rules explicitly citing the events of January 1873 as their justification. The federal government's weather warning infrastructure expanded gradually in the years following the disaster, though never as quickly or as thoroughly as critics of the system demanded. The Army Signal Corps, which had operated the nation's fledgling weather service since 1870, received modestly increased funding through the mid-1870s, adding additional observation stations across the northern plains and extending telegraph lines further into rural territory than had existed at the time of the Great Blizzard. Full national weather forecasting, reliable enough to warn isolated rural households days in advance, remained decades away, not truly achieved in any comprehensive form until well into the 20th century. But the seeds of that eventual system, however slowly they grew, trace directly back to disasters like the one that killed Anna Kessler's neighbours and nearly claimed her husband. County and territorial governments also began developing more formal disaster relief mechanisms in the years following 1873, moving away from the previous informal system where neighbouring communities simply did what they could to help survivors on an ad hoc basis. Dakota Territory's legislature debated, and eventually passed, measures providing modest financial assistance to families who had lost livestock, homes, or breadwinners during severe weather events, an early and imperfect precursor to the kind of organised disaster relief systems that would become far more sophisticated over the following century. Insurance itself, still a relatively new concept for ordinary farming families in the 1870s, began finding a foothold on the frontier in the years following the blizzard. A handful of mutual aid associations formed across affected counties, small cooperative arrangements where neighbouring farmers pooled modest annual contributions to create a shared fund available to any member family that suffered catastrophic livestock losses during severe weather. These associations were informal, sometimes little more than a ledger book and a handshake agreement, but they represented an early recognition that no single family, however well prepared, could fully protect itself against a disaster of this scale acting alone. For families like the Kesslers, these broader changes mattered less in the moment than the immediate practical adjustments made on their own 160 acres. Joseph rebuilt the rope system connecting house to barn using thicker, tarred rope less likely to snap under ice, and added a second line running to the chicken coop, and well after nearly losing his way to those closer structures as well during a lesser storm the following winter, Anna insisted on stocking twice the fuel reserve they'd previously considered adequate, a habit she maintained for the rest of her life on that land, filling the hay basket and wood pile to a level that struck later, more comfortable generations of her family as almost obsessive. She also began keeping a small store of dried food and blankets inside the barn itself, reasoning that if either of them were ever caught there again in a storm this severe, they shouldn't have to rely entirely on the warmth of 3 cows to survive until morning. The grasshopper plague of 1874, arriving just a year after the blizzard, tested the Kesslers again in an entirely different way, and Anna would later describe that second disaster as somehow easier to bear than the winter had been, not because the material losses were smaller, but because grasshoppers, unlike a blizzard, gave a family daylight hours and clear skies in which to fight back, to salvage what they could, to see the danger coming and respond to it in real time. That distinction mattered to her more than most people who hadn't lived through both kinds of disaster could ever fully understand or appreciate. By the time the Kesslers finally proved up their claim in 1875, securing full legal ownership of the 160 acres they'd risked everything to reach, the landscape around their home had visibly changed. Young trees, still slight but growing steadily, lined the property where nothing had stood before at all. Neighbouring families had adopted similar precautions, thicker ropes, deeper fuel reserves, more cautious school policies, a whole community reorganising its daily habits around a lesson written in the coldest possible ink. None of these changes could undo what the storm had already taken. Sophie Lindqvist never fully recovered from the loss of the 2 students she hadn't been able to save, and she left teaching within 2 years, moving east to a quieter life far from the plains that had nearly broken her. The Nebraska rancher who'd trusted 15 years of experience over caution was buried that spring in a cemetery that grew, storm by storm and decade by decade, into one of the largest in the county. Anders Halverson, who'd kept his children inside and lost nothing that January, would tell the story for the rest of his life as a lesson in humility rather than a point of pride, insisting that luck and hard-won caution had saved his family in equal measure, and that a slightly different storm, arriving a year earlier before his own costly mistake had taught him restraint, might easily have ended differently. What the storm did leave behind, alongside its grief, was a frontier slightly better equipped to survive the next one, a landscape and a set of habits shaped permanently by 3 catastrophic days in January, still visible in windbreaks and school policies and warning systems built by people who understood, in the most painful way possible, exactly what happens when a system fails to account for the worst the sky can deliver. Anna Kessler's hands, 20 years after that January, had gained a new kind of steadiness, the particular calm of someone who had already survived the worst thing she could imagine and understood in her bones that she could survive whatever came next. She was 46 years old by then. Grey, threading through hair she still wore in the same simple braid her mother had taught her back in Stuttgart, standing on a porch attached to an actual wooden house. Not a soddy built plank by plank over years of harvests good enough to finally afford real lumber. The woman who'd once stood frozen with fear at a frosted window, watching her husband vanish into a wall of white, had become something the Dakota frontier hadn't quite had a name for yet. A figure other families in the county now sought out specifically during hard winters, someone whose calm, practical instructions on preparing for severe weather had, over 2 decades, taken on the weight of local wisdom. That transformation, repeated in countless variations across hundreds of families throughout the affected territory, represents something larger than any single person's personal growth. It represents a genuine shift in how an entire generation of frontier settlers understood themselves, their land, and their relationship to danger. Before the Great Blizzard of 1873, frontier optimism had carried a particular flavour, buoyed by railroad pamphlets and government land offers, and a genuine, if naive, belief that hard work alone could conquer whatever the land presented. After the storm, that optimism didn't disappear, but it changed shape, tempered by a harder, more clear-eyed understanding that no amount of hard work could fully protect a family from forces entirely outside human control. Settlers who survived that winter carried forward a particular blend of determination and humility that would come to define much of the broader Midwestern character in the decades that followed. A willingness to work relentlessly toward a better future paired with an unsentimental acceptance that nature could, and eventually would, humble even the most prepared among them. This shift showed up in small, quiet ways that rarely made it into official histories. Farmers who'd once bragged about pushing through marginal weather to finish a task began speaking instead about knowing when to stop, when to wait, when patience mattered more than progress. A kind of communal folk wisdom developed around the specific warning signs that had preceded the 1873 storm, a sudden warmth followed by an unnatural stillness, birds behaving strangely, a particular colour to the western sky that old-timers claim to recognise decades later, passed down not through any official channel, but through repeated conversation at church gatherings and shared meals, the same way any hard-earned survival knowledge tends to spread through a community that has genuinely learned from disaster. Historians studying frontier diaries and letters from the years following the blizzard note a marked shift in tone, away from the breathless, almost romantic optimism common in earlier correspondence, toward something plainer, steadier, more focused on practical preparation than on the dream of easy prosperity that had originally drawn so many families west. Women in particular began keeping more detailed household journals during this period, documenting fuel reserves, weather patterns, emergency preparations, and lessons learned from near disasters, creating an informal body of practical knowledge passed down through families in a way that hadn't existed as systematically before. Anna kept just such a journal herself, a plain leather-bound book she started in the spring of 1873 and continued adding to for the rest of her life, filled not with sentiment but with dates, temperatures, fuel counts, and small practical notes intended for whichever of her children eventually inherited the responsibility of running this land. That journal survived, passed down through 3 generations of Kessler descendants, eventually finding its way into a regional historical society archive, where researchers now study it as one of the more detailed first-hand accounts of daily frontier life during this transitional period. Entries from the years immediately following the blizzard read almost like an instruction manual, precise measurements of hay and wood reserves, careful notes on which neighbours could be relied upon for help and which lived too far to reach quickly, small practical observations that reveal a woman who had transformed raw fear into methodical, unsentimental preparation. Later entries, written as her children grew older, show that same practical voice gradually softening into something closer to reflection, still grounded in specific detail, but occasionally allowing space for the kind of quiet gratitude that comes only after decades of hard-won survival. She and Joseph had 3 more children in the years following that winter, all of them born after the daughter they'd buried in 1871, and Anna raised each of them with a particular deliberate insistence on understanding weather, on respecting the rope lines strung between buildings, on never ever assuming that a calm morning guaranteed a calm afternoon. Her eldest surviving son, born in 1874, would later tell his own children about growing up in a household where his mother treated the sky itself as something requiring constant, careful attention, a habit of vigilance he initially found excessive as a boy, and came to deeply appreciate as an adult raising his own family on that same unforgiving land. The broader community around the Kesslers transformed in parallel ways. Barn raisings and harvest celebrations continued, the genuine joy of frontier social life never fully disappearing beneath the caution the storm had instilled, but a new seriousness accompanied conversations about weather that hadn't existed before January of 1873. Neighbours checked on each other more consistently during uncertain weather, a habit born directly from painful memory rather than any formal policy, informal networks of mutual watchfulness that would eventually mature into the more organised rural cooperation systems that came to define much of Midwestern farming culture for generations afterward. Church congregations across the affected counties began holding an annual memorial service each January, a tradition that started informally in the first anniversary of the storm and continued, in some communities, for decades afterward, a shared moment each winter to remember the dead and to reaffirm the practical lessons the living had drawn from that loss. These services rarely involved elaborate ceremony, usually little more than a reading of names and a shared meal afterward, but they served a purpose beyond simple remembrance, reinforcing year after year the specific, hard-won caution that had kept subsequent winters from claiming nearly as many lives. Sophie Linkovich's departure from teaching, mentioned in an earlier chapter of this story, represented one path through this transformation. Grief so profound it required leaving the land entirely to find any peace. Anna's path represented another, equally valid response to catastrophe, staying, adapting, and slowly transforming private trauma into practical wisdom that could protect others from suffering the same loss. Neither response was wrong. Both reflected the genuine range of human reaction to a disaster this profound, and both, in their own way, shaped the character of the communities that grew up around them in the decades that followed. By the 1890s, the Dakota and Nebraska frontier that Anna Kessler had first encountered as a frightened 23-year-old bride had transformed into something recognizably different, dotted with windbreaks and established towns and a rural culture built around hard-won caution rather than untested optimism. The wide-open, treeless plains that had offered nothing to slow a storm's approach in 1873 had given way, acre by planted acre, to a landscape shaped deliberately by people who understood exactly what that emptiness could cost. Anna Kessler lived to see her grandchildren born on that same 160 acres, her family had originally staked a desperate claim to in 1870, watched a wooden farmhouse replace the soddy she'd once called home, and carried, for the rest of her long life, a particular clarity about what truly mattered that she attributed, whenever anyone asked her about it, directly to the winter that had nearly taken her husband and had permanently changed how she understood her own capacity for courage. She rarely spoke in detail about that January night in the barn. When she did, decades later, to grandchildren gathered around a stove far warmer and more reliable than anything she'd known in 1873, she described it not as her worst memory, but as the moment she finally understood exactly what she was capable of when everything she loved depended on it. That understanding, passed down through a family and a community shaped by shared catastrophe, would carry forward into a future none of them could yet imagine, one where the hardships of the frontier would eventually give way to entirely new challenges, new storms, and new tests of exactly the same fundamental question Anna had faced alone in that howling darkness. Whether courage like hers could still be found when the next disaster inevitably arrived, in whatever unfamiliar form it chose to take, remained an open question every single generation after hers would eventually have to answer for itself. That single line in Anna Kessler's journal, written sometime in the winter of 1878, 5 years after the storm that nearly took her husband, reads simply, "Trust the sky less than you trust yourself, and trust yourself less than you think you should." She never explained that line further in the pages that followed. She didn't need to. By 1878, Anna had raised 3 more children on that same claim, buried 1 daughter, nearly lost her husband to a storm that killed hundreds of her neighbours, survived a grasshopper plague that had stripped an entire year's harvest down to bare stalks, and built, slowly and deliberately, the kind of calm authority that other families in the county had come to rely on during hard winters. That single sentence, tucked between entries about fuel counts and planting schedules, represented the distilled result of everything those years had taught her. Not a philosophy borrowed from a book or a sermon, but a hard, private conclusion reached through actual, lived experience. Everything this story has shown you, the rope that failed, the rancher whose 15 years of experience led him straight into a fatal mistake, the immigrant family who survived precisely because their fear hadn't yet curdled into overconfidence, points toward a single, specific truth that the Great Blizzard of 1873 taught an entire generation the hardest possible way. Danger doesn't announce itself in proportion to how well you know a place. That's not a lesson about community, or about the importance of neighbours helping neighbours, however true that might also be. It's something sharper and more personal than that, a discovery about the particular quiet trap that familiarity sets for anyone who has ever survived something difficult before and mistaken that survival for mastery. Think about that for a moment, because it applies to almost nothing in particular, and almost everything in daily life at the very same time. The experienced rancher who died within sight of his own barn wasn't reckless in any ordinary sense of the word. He was, by every reasonable measure available to him, an expert. A man who had genuinely earned the confidence he carried into that storm through years of accumulated hard-won success. His mistake wasn't ignorance. It was the specific, invisible failure of applying yesterday's hard-earned knowledge to a day that had quietly stopped following yesterday's rules. Consider, too, how differently this same wisdom applied to Anders Halvorsen, the neighbour who kept his children inside that afternoon rather than risk the walk to his barn. His caution wasn't born from wisdom in any traditional sense, not from years of careful study or inherited local knowledge. It came from a single humiliating failure the year before, a storm he'd misjudged and nearly paid for with real losses, a failure that taught him something no success ever could have, that his own read of Dakota weather remained fundamentally unreliable, no matter how many winters he survived. That single crack in his confidence uncomfortable and costly as it had been to earn, may have saved his entire family's life the following January. This is a different kind of wisdom than the usual frontier morality tale about preparation and grit, and it's worth sitting with precisely because it's less comfortable than those familiar stories. Preparation matters enormously, of course. Grit matters too. But neither preparation nor grit protected the people who died closest to their own front doors that January, because the failure that killed them wasn't a failure of effort or courage. It was a failure to recognize the exact moment when accumulated experience stopped being useful information and became instead a dangerous kind of blindness. Anna Kessler survived that night specifically because she never fully trusted her own competence on this land. Not the way Josef did. Not the way the rancher 3 counties over did. She'd arrived only 3 years earlier, still carrying the fresh, unresolved fear of someone who understood she didn't yet fully know this place. And that fear, uncomfortable and unwelcome as it felt at the time, turned out to be the very thing that kept her moving carefully enough, thinking clearly enough, refusing to simply trust the familiar shape of a barn wall in a whiteout to eventually find her husband and pull him back from the edge of a death that had already claimed so many people more experienced than either of them. There's a specific, practical shape to this wisdom that extends well past frontier survival, well past blizzards, well past the 19th century entirely. Every field of human endeavour eventually produces its own version of the confident rancher, the surgeon who's performed the same procedure 1,000 times and stops double-checking the details that once felt essential, the pilot who's flown the same route so often that pre-flight checks start to feel like formality rather than necessity, the parent who's driven the same road home from work for a decade and stops watching quite as closely for the exact moment a child's ball rolls into the street. None of these people are careless in any obvious sense. They are almost universally people who have earned real competence through real experience, and who have therefore also earned the specific, dangerous blind spot that competence tends to create. Safety researchers studying modern workplace accidents have documented a strikingly similar pattern across entirely different industries, a phenomenon sometimes called normalization of deviance, where small deviations from careful procedure, repeated without consequence enough times, gradually come to feel like an acceptable new normal rather than a growing risk. A worker who skips a safety check 10 times without incident doesn't learn that the check was unnecessary. He learns, falsely and dangerously, that skipping it carries no real cost, right up until the 11th time, when circumstances happen to align just differently enough to produce a catastrophic result. This is precisely the mechanism that killed the Nebraska rancher in 1873, and it remains, in different clothing, one of the most persistent and least understood sources of preventable disaster in nearly every high-stakes human activity today. The wisdom this story leaves behind isn't a warning against confidence itself. Confidence, earned honestly through real experience, remains one of the most valuable things any person can carry into a difficult life. The wisdom is narrower and more specific than that, a discovery about the particular moment when confidence needs to pause and ask an uncomfortable question. Does this situation actually match the situation that taught me to trust myself in the first place? Or does it only resemble that situation closely enough to fool me? That question rarely announces itself clearly in the moment it matters most. It arrives disguised as an ordinary afternoon, a familiar walk, a task performed 1,000 times before without incident, precisely the conditions under which a person is least inclined to stop and ask whether this particular instance might be different from all the others. Anna Kessler's genius, if it can even be called that, wasn't some special insight unavailable to her more experienced neighbours. It was simply that she hadn't yet earned the kind of confidence that makes asking that question feel unnecessary. And in this one specific case, that gap in her experience became the very thing that saved a life. Anna Kessler asked herself exactly that question at her frosted window on January 7th, 1873. Though she wouldn't have described it in those exact terms at the time, she simply understood, in the marrow-deep way that fear sometimes clarifies things logic alone cannot. That everything about this particular afternoon felt different from every other afternoon she'd survived on this land, and that difference was worth trusting more than her own accumulated sense of familiarity with the walk between her house and her barn. What's remarkable is how little that recognition had to do with formal knowledge or years of study. Anna hadn't read a weather manual or learned to interpret barometric pressure the way a trained meteorologist might. She'd simply stayed close enough to her own uncertainty, close enough to that unresolved, that single moment of humility. Choosing caution over confidence at the exact instant confidence would have felt entirely justified is the discovery this story ultimately offers. Not a lesson about weather or about frontier hardships specifically, but about the quiet, universal danger of assuming that because you have survived something before, you fully understand it now. The land itself never changed its rules that January, not for one single hour. It simply revealed, in the space of a single afternoon, how many people had mistaken years of good luck for genuine understanding, and how thin the line actually was between the two. Somewhere in your own family history, whether you've ever traced it or not, there's likely a version of Anna Kessler's window, a moment when someone you're descended from stood at the edge of a decision that could have gone very differently. A border crossed, a ship boarded, a storm survived, a choice made in circumstances far harder than anything most of us will ever face. You exist, at least in part, because that decision went the way it did. Maybe you've never heard the specific story. Maybe it was never written down, never passed along in any letter or journal, lost somewhere between the generation that lived it and the one telling stories about it decades later at a holiday dinner table. That absence of detail doesn't make the debt any less real. Somewhere behind nearly every American sitting comfortably tonight is a person who once stood exactly where Anna Kessler stood, facing a version of the same impossible choice, and who happened, through some combination of courage and luck, to choose correctly. That's not sentimentality. It's simple math, repeated across millions of American families whose ancestors arrived from somewhere else, gambled everything on a piece of land or a factory job or a chance at something better, and either survived long enough to build a life here or didn't. The story of the Great Blizzard of 1873 belongs to a specific place and a specific window of history, but the underlying pattern it reveals belongs to something much larger, the particular, unglamorous grit required to build an entire country out of strangers who arrived speaking different languages, carrying different fears, betting everything on a promise that often turned out to be only partly true. America has always told itself a certain story about the frontier, a story of rugged individualism, of self-made success through sheer will and hard work, cowboys and homesteaders conquering an empty land through grit alone. That story isn't entirely wrong, but it's incomplete in ways that matter, and the winter of 1873 exposes exactly where the gaps sit. The frontier wasn't empty. It belonged first to native nations who had lived on it for countless generations, before any railroad pamphlet ever promised it to a farmer in Hanover or Stuttgart or Bergen. The settlers who arrived to claim it weren't simply rugged individuals conquering nature through personal grit. They were, in enormous numbers, desperate immigrants recruited by companies with their own financial interests, arriving with debts, with fears, with children who sometimes didn't survive the journey, or the years that followed. And the survival that did happen, when it happened, rarely came from individual toughness alone. It came from a rope tied between a house and a barn. It came from a neighbour 2 miles away who chose caution over confidence. It came from a woman who refused to accept that her husband was already lost. This complicated, layered reality sits uncomfortably alongside the simpler story America has traditionally told about its own westward expansion, a story where hardship exists mainly to be conquered, where the land itself is framed as an obstacle waiting to be tamed rather than a home that already belonged to someone else, and where survival gets attributed almost entirely to personal character rather than the messy combination of systemic failure, sheer luck, and quiet mutual aid that actually determined who lived and who didn't. Neither the simple triumphant version nor a purely cynical rejection of it fully captures what happened on this land. The truth sits in the harder, less comfortable space between those two stories, a place where genuine courage and genuine injustice coexisted, where real resilience grew directly out of a settlement system that was, in many respects, deeply flawed and often cruel to the people it displaced. This is the more honest version of the American frontier story, less a triumphant march of rugged individuals and more a fragile interdependent web of people making imperfect decisions under impossible pressure, some of whom lived, some of whom didn't, almost none of whom did it entirely alone. If you're an American listening to this tonight, there's a real chance some thread of your own family history runs through a story like this one, whether the specific details involve a Dakota blizzard or a different hardship entirely, a different ocean crossed, a different frontier of a different kind. Maybe it's a grandparent who arrived with nothing and worked 3 jobs to build something. Maybe it's an ancestor who survived a different kind of disaster in a different American century, a flood, a depression, a war that took everything and forced an entire generation to rebuild from less than nothing. The specific hardship changes, the underlying shape of the American experience, arriving somewhere unfamiliar, facing a danger the old rules didn't prepare you for, surviving through some combination of luck, stubbornness, and the help of people who happened to be standing nearby when it mattered, repeats itself again and again across this country's entire history, in every century, among every group of people who ever arrived here hoping for something better. There's a particular kind of American identity built directly on top of stories like Anna Kessler's, one that doesn't get discussed often enough in the version of history taught in most classrooms. It's not the identity of the solitary cowboy riding alone into the sunset. It's the identity of people who understood, often through painful experience, that survival on genuinely hostile ground requires exactly the kind of interdependence that the frontier myth tends to erase. Ropes strung between buildings, neighbours checking on neighbours, communities slowly building shared knowledge out of shared loss. That identity persisted long after the frontier itself closed, showing up in every American community that has ever organised itself around a shared vulnerability. Small towns that flood every spring and rebuild together every summer. Coastal communities that brace for hurricanes as a matter of annual ritual. Rural counties where neighbours still check on each other during severe winter storms, not because any law requires it, but because 150 years of hard experience taught this particular corner of the country exactly what happens when no one does. You can still see it today in the way certain American regions organise themselves specifically around whatever disaster their particular corner of the country tends to produce. Storm shelters built into Midwestern basements as a matter of course. Evacuation routes memorised by Gulf Coast families the way other Americans memorise their own phone numbers. Wildfire go-bags kept ready by families living along the wooded edges of the American West. None of these habits exist because some government agency mandated them. They exist because communities, generation after generation, absorbed the same hard lesson Anna Kessler's generation absorbed on the Dakota Plains, that the specific danger native to your particular ground eventually arrives, whether you're prepared for it or not, and that preparation, however imperfect, remains the only real defense available against a threat you cannot ultimately control. Anna Kessler never thought of herself as building an American identity. She thought of herself as trying to keep her family alive on land that had nearly killed them once already, one difficult season at a time. But the accumulation of choices like hers, repeated across millions of families in millions of specific circumstances, is precisely how a national character actually forms, not through some abstract philosophy handed down from above, but through countless individual people making countless individual choices under real pressure, and the survivors passing forward whatever wisdom that pressure managed to teach them. You are, in some meaningful sense, the inheritor of exactly that accumulated wisdom, whether your own family arrived on this land 3 centuries ago or 3 years ago. The specific hardship your ancestors faced may bear no resemblance to a Dakota blizzard, but the underlying question every one of them eventually faced, whether to trust the familiar rules of a life they'd known, or to recognize the moment those rules had quietly stopped applying, is a question this country has asked every single generation of people who ever tried to build something on its ground. Anna Kessler's answer to that question, chosen alone at a frosted window on the worst night of her life, became part of a much larger American answer, repeated with variations by millions of people whose names never made it into any history book at all. What that answer ultimately built, one frozen night and one desperate decision at a time, is still standing today, in windbreaks planted a century and a half ago, in school policies born from a tragedy no one wanted to repeat, and in a particular quiet resilience that runs through American communities that have learned, the hard way, exactly what it costs to underestimate the ground beneath their own feet. That resilience carries a cost too, one this story hasn't fully addressed yet, and one that reaches forward from 1873 into a future none of the people in this story could have possibly imagined. Somewhere, right now, an engineer's running a final check on a life support system, destined for a habitat on Mars, tracing the same rope and barn logic Anna Kessler once lived by, without ever knowing her name. A tether meant to guarantee that no matter how disorienting the environment outside becomes, a person will always be able to find their way back to warmth, to air, to safety. That engineer has run this same check hundreds of times before, on hundreds of nearly identical systems, and each successful check makes the next one feel a little more routine, a little more certain, a little less like the difference between life and death, and a little more like simple procedure. That's not a flaw in the engineer's character, and it never has been, in any century on any frontier. It's the exact same accumulation of earned, reasonable confidence that carried a Nebraska rancher out into a blizzard he believed he understood, the same confidence that let Joseph Kessler trust a rope he'd walked to 100 times without incident. That tether will fail someone eventually. Not because engineers are careless, and not because the technology is weak, but because every system humans have ever built to survive a hostile frontier eventually meets the one set of conditions its designers never quite imagined, the storm that arrives at 40 below when the morning felt like spring, the failure that strikes exactly where the safety line was supposed to hold. This is not a story about climate, about a warming planet or a changing atmosphere. It's a story about something older and more constant than weather itself. The particular unbroken thread running from a Dakota soddy in 1873 to a pressurized dome on a red, airless plain sometime in this century. The thread of human beings choosing to live somewhere. The environment does not naturally sustain them. betting everything on ropes and systems and accumulated confidence that this time the ground beneath their feet will behave the way it always has before. Anna Kessler never imagined Mars. She couldn't have imagined electricity reaching every home in America, let alone a spacecraft, let alone a colony built on a planet with no breathable air at all. She died in 1919, an old woman by then, having lived long enough to see automobiles replace horses on the roads near her farm, and electric lights replace the kerosene lamp she'd once watched her own breath fog in front of. Technological changes that would have seemed as impossible to her 26-year-old self as a Martian colony seems to us tonight. But she understood something that any future Mars settler will eventually have to understand in exactly the same visceral, immediate way she did, standing at her frosted window in January of 1873. Confidence, however earned, is only ever a bet, never a guarantee. And the moment you stop remembering that difference is the moment the frontier, whatever frontier you happen to be standing on, decides to collect what it's owed. Every human frontier operates by this same unforgiving arithmetic. The Dakota Prairie of 1873 killed people who trusted a rope they'd tied 100 times before. A future Martian habitat will eventually kill someone who trusts an oxygen system, a pressure seal, a stretch of routine maintenance performed so many times it stopped feeling like a matter of life and death at all. The tools change beyond anything a 19th century homesteader could recognize. The fundamental gamble, the one Anna made when she stepped through her own door into a wall of screaming white, remains exactly the same gamble every frontier eventually demands of the people brave enough or desperate enough to live on it. Think about the specific texture of that gamble for a moment, because it isn't abstract. It's the particular physical sensation of stepping past a threshold you know to be dangerous, trusting a system you have every reasonable evidence to trust, and discovering only afterward whether that trust was justified this time or not. Anna felt it in her fingers as the cold worked past her wool coat. A future Mars settler will feel some version of the same sensation in the silence of a suit seal, in the particular hum of a life support system that sounds, for just a moment, slightly different than it did the day before. The sensation doesn't change across centuries, even when everything surrounding it does. What made Anna's story worth telling wasn't the storm itself. Storms happened constantly on that land, before her arrival and long after. What made it worth telling was the specific human moment when a woman who had every reasonable excuse to stay inside, to protect herself, to accept a loss that felt entirely outside her control, chose instead to step into conditions that had already killed people more experienced than she was, and somehow found her way back with the one person she couldn't imagine losing. That choice cost her almost everything she had left to give that night. Her hands, by the time she finally sat still in that barn with Yosef breathing steadily beside her, had gone past pain into a kind of numbness that would leave faint scars for the rest of her life, a permanent physical reminder of exactly how close she'd come to losing far more than warmth. It also proved something about her, and about the particular resilience carried by everyone who has ever bet their life on unfamiliar ground, that no amount of comfort or safety or advanced technology will ever fully replace. The willingness to keep moving forward through a world that has gone completely white, trusting nothing but a rope, a voice, and the stubborn refusal to let go. That willingness doesn't disappear just because the frontier changes shape. It didn't disappear when railroads finally connected the Dakota Plains to the rest of the country, and it didn't disappear when telephone lines and paved roads, and eventually the internet made isolation on that same ground almost unimaginable to later generations. It will not disappear when humans finally stand on the surface of another planet either. However advanced their equipment, however thoroughly tested their systems, However confident their engineers feel, walking into mission control on the morning everything is scheduled to launch. Somewhere on a future frontier none of us can fully picture yet, someone is going to face a version of Anna Kessler's choice, alone, in an environment infinitely stranger than a Dakota blizzard, with systems infinitely more advanced than a length of rope tied to a barn door. They will trust those systems the way Joseph trusted his own experience, the way a Nebraska rancher trusted 15 years of good weather, right up until the moment those systems failed to account for the one condition no one thought to prepare for. Perhaps it happens on Mars, perhaps it happens somewhere closer to home, in a future America reshaped by challenges none of us can yet name with any real precision. A new kind of frontier built from new kinds of danger, populated by people who will feel, in their own way, exactly what Anna felt standing at that window, watching a familiar world turn suddenly and completely unfamiliar in the space of a single afternoon. The specific shape of that future frontier remains unknown. What remains entirely knowable, because it has repeated itself in every generation since humans first began settling ground that didn't naturally sustain them, is that someone, somewhere, will eventually face that exact same test, and will have only seconds to decide whether the confidence they've built serves them or blinds them. And in that moment, whatever year it happens to be, whatever unimaginable frontier it happens to occur on, the same question Anna asked herself at her window will still be waiting, patient and unchanged across a century and a half and for many more centuries follow it. Do you trust what experience has taught you, or do you trust what's actually happening in front of you right now? Anna Kessler chose correctly, once, on one impossibly cold night in January of 1873, and a family, a farm, and eventually generations of descendants she would never fully know continued forward because of that single choice. She never received a medal for it, never appeared in any history book beyond a single line in a county ledger, never knew that her decision at that window would echo, in principle if not in detail, across every frontier her country would eventually attempt to conquer after her own. Somewhere out past the edge of everything we currently understand, another person is going to face the same silent, frozen window, waiting to find out whether they will choose as well as she did. Some frontier families spent entire winters in dugouts carved into the earth, listening to blizzards pass overhead while trying to keep a single fire alive. The hardships they faced were rarely written into famous history books, but they shaped everyday life across the frontier. Sharing stories like theirs is why I started Bedtime Sleepy. Sleep well, and I'll see you in the next story.